Panentheism is a form of the doctrine of God. It's the idea that everything exists within God, the notion that the whole universe is in some sense located within the divine. The word panentheism sounds rather like pantheism, and the two words are often confused, and panentheism is sometimes mistaken for pantheism. But the two concepts are definitely distinct. Indeed, it was because the two words sound so similar that one theologian, John Macquarrie, preferred not to use the word panentheism, and for a while in his work he employed an alternative term instead. Pantheism comes from the Greek pan, meaning all, and theos, meaning God, and so pantheism is the idea that everything is God, that God and the cosmos are identical, the two are coterminous. Panentheism is very different. The N in the middle makes all the difference. The word comes from the Greek pan, all, en or in, and theos or God, and so it's the idea that all is in God. Everything exists within the divine. God is more than the cosmos. God is not exhausted by the cosmos. The cosmos, as it were, sits within God. God contains the cosmos and goes beyond it. Surprisingly, some textbooks about Christian theology and Christian doctrine don't feature panentheism in the index. That's slightly strange for two reasons. First, a number of prominent theologians have either identified themselves as panentheists or been identified as panentheists by others, such theologians as Paul Tillich, Jürgen Moltmann, John Macquarrie, Sally McFague, Arthur Peacock, Yvonne Gebbara, and Catherine Keller, dozens and dozens of them, in fact. Second, in recent years, there's been a huge amount of writing about panentheism. It's really mushroomed. Not all of it in favour, of course, but nonetheless, the fact that the idea is being talked about and discussed and defined and refined and arguments put for and against shows that it's a concept of contemporary theological interest and indeed validity. Panentheism tends to be seen as a middle position, even a mediating position, between pantheism, which we've just seen is the idea that the cosmos is God, and classical theism, the notion of God that's been classically received, the model of God that's by and large been handed down to us. God defined by the classic attributes of omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, immutability, impassibility, and having aseity or self-sufficiency, all of which tends to make God rather separate, apart, and wholly other. Panentheism begins to interrogate some of those traditional attributes, and in that sense, if you regard classical theism as holding a sort of hegemony on Christian theology, almost an imperium on Christian thought, then you could regard panentheism as beginning to challenge that dominance, almost, it could be said, a post-colonial form of the doctrine of God. Or you might say, if the doctrine of God has been hitherto regarded in binary terms, God as either totally out there on the one hand or totally within on the other, identified with the cosmos or human projection and no more than that. If the doctrine of God has been conceived in those binary terms until relatively recently, then it could be said that panentheism is a queering of that binary framework, a queering of the doctrine of God. That doesn't mean to say that it's unorthodox. A number of scholars have claimed that panentheism, even as it queers what has been popularly received and believed, is, at the very same time, entirely orthodox, a true form of faith detectable in Christian tradition right back to Scripture itself. There's been a great strand in Christian tradition, stretching from Nicholas of Cusa through Hegel to Paul Tillich, that argues that there can't be anything external to the infinite. If anything were external to the infinite, then the infinite wouldn't be infinite. Therefore, what is infinite, God, has to include what is finite, the cosmos. So the cosmos, philosophically and conceptually, has to be included within God. And there are certainly resonances of panentheism in the Bible. In the Acts of the Apostles, Paul says that in God we live and move and have our being. In the epistles, the word "in" is used about the relation between God or Christ and all that is. In John's Gospel, there's a lot of language about mutual indwelling, God abiding in us and we in God. So a number of scholars have claimed that panentheism, rather than classical theism, more accurately, more nearly, more neatly expresses the heart of Christian faith, the God of Scripture. One of the difficulties is that everything existing within God, the word panentheism itself, doesn't fully capture the essence of the idea, because one entity can exist within another in quite an alien way. Think of a cherry stone swallowed by a human body. It exists within it, but as a foreign or unnatural part. Well, panentheism is wanting to express a more natural relation, a closer affinity between God and the cosmos than that. Philip Clayton, a contemporary panentheist, has said that for panentheism to be panentheism, the notion of everything existing within God has to be supplemented with the simultaneous idea of God being in all things. God pervades the cosmos at the same time as everything is within God. That conveys the sense of mutual coherence that we find in Scripture. Instead of a cherry stone, the cosmos within God is more like an unborn child within its mother's womb. Part of the mother, contained within the mother, not separate from the mother as the child would be if it were born, wholly dependent on the mother, and yet with a degree of freedom and beyond the mother's total control. The child within the womb is a very good analogy for the relation between the cosmos and God in panentheism. And the unborn child affects the mother too. The mother is not impassive to her child. That's why panentheism begins to chip away at, undermine the classical attribute of impassibility, the notion that God is entirely unmoved or unchanged by the cosmos. If a changing entity exists within a larger one, then that larger sphere or realm will be changed as a result. Perhaps not significantly. Panentheists are in no way saying that the relation between God and cosmos is symmetrical. In many, if not all ways, it's asymmetrical. But they are wanting to carve out the conceptual space, the possibility for God to be affected by the cosmos that in some way exists within God's self. Process theologians say that God changes in concrete ways, while there's an abstract pole of God which doesn't change. God's nature as love, for example, or God's very own existence. Those are aspects of God that remain the same, while other aspects of God change. Most process theologians would identify themselves as panentheists, and so, by and large, process theology can be regarded as a subset of panentheism. Process theologians are generally panentheists, but not all panentheists are process theologians. Not all panentheists sign up to the particular form of panentheism that is process theology. So, in an article in the Oxford Handbook of Science and Religion, I proposed a threefold definition of panentheism, which I think still holds good. First, that God is more than the cosmos. That distinguishes panentheism from forms of pantheism in which God is the cosmos. Second, that God is not separate from the cosmos, as often seems to be the case in classical theism. And third, that God in some way is affected by the cosmos. That distinguishes panentheism from forms of classical theism in which God is present to the cosmos, indeed omnipresent, but impassible, not actually affected by being present to the cosmos. Those three things, that God is more than the cosmos, that at the same time God is not separate from the cosmos, and that God is in some way affected by the cosmos, those three assertions, I think, give us a pretty reliable and robust definition of panentheism. So having defined panentheism, having given some indication of what the word refers to, what are the advantages of subscribing to it? Why might one opt for this doctrine of God as opposed to a form of classical theism or a form of pantheism? Well, I think that there are a number of benefits to working with a panentheistic model of God. I think we can identify at least 5 such benefits. First of all, I think that panentheism accords more closely with religious experience than either forms of classical theism or forms of pantheism. A lot of people describe their religious experience as of something transcendent coming in and through something that is everyday, something ordinary, something routine. The more than, the something else, isn't totally foreign, totally alien, totally outside, but somehow imbues, suffuses, undergirds something of this world with greater light or life or richness or depth or however one wants to describe it. It's not just the worldly phenomenon on its own, it's not pantheism, it's something from beyond, if you like, something transcendent, and yet the transcendence is integrally related to, inseparable from, something within the cosmos. That, it seems to me, is quite a common framework for religious experience, and the philosophical structure behind it appears to be panentheistic. Something beyond that is at the very same time inseparable from, connected with, intertwined with something of the world that we see and know. The experience itself may be precisely one of inseparability between this cosmos and something that transcends it. People talk of a sense of oneness or union with something beyond while retaining their own individual integrity. That's the metaphysical makeup, if you like, of panentheism. Beyond yet within, integrally connected, inextricably intertwined, God and cosmos, transcendence and immanence. Indeed, the theologian John Robinson in the 1960s talked of transcendence within immanence. So panentheism, for that reason, has the potential, I think, to connect heart and head, to make theological sense of our religious experience, to give philosophical structure, if you like, to our spirituality, to ensure that there's no dissonance between our experience of the numinous and our conceptual thinking. It's no coincidence that a lot of panentheism has been expressed in the context of mysticism. This is also, I think, the significance, talking of John Robinson, of his book Honest to God, which provoked such a storm when it was published in 1963. What it was essentially offering was a panentheistic view of God. That was too much for some people who were firmly wedded to classical theistic ways of thinking and who reacted strongly against the book because they felt it was undercutting a notion of God in which they'd been nurtured and which had so come to represent God for them that any departure from that was unthinkable. But for many others, it was a revelation. Here, for the first time, was a theological teacher, a bishop, in words that they could understand, showing a view and conception of divinity that cohered with what they felt and experienced deep down. The book was genuinely an eye-opener. It made faith come alive. It was articulating what they had long felt, but something for which they had never had the adequate language. Both of those reactions, for and against, show that Robinson was offering a coherent panentheistic concept of God in contradistinction to a classical view which had effectively become the default doctrine. The equivalent text in the United States, it seems to me, came 30 years later with Marcus Borg's The God We Never Knew. Here, Borg talks explicitly about panentheism. In honest to God, the panentheism was implicit, although John Robinson was using the word panentheism within a year or two. Borg talks explicitly about panentheism as enabling faith to make sense for him, really, for the first time. The panentheistic God was the God he never knew, yet a God who he found revealed in Scripture and pointed to by tradition, a God who simply got obscured by classical theistic interpretations, he thought, of the faith.